Picture a bustling European port in the 1300s. Ships loaded with goods from distant lands unload their cargo, silks, spices, and something far more deadly. At first, no one notices the rats scurrying down the ropes, carrying with them a silent killer. Within days, the first person falls ill, a fever that burns like fire. Swollen lymph nodes turning the skin black. Death comes swiftly, sometimes within hours. Neighbors bar their doors, but it's too late. The plague surges through the streets, leaving corpses piled in the gutters. Families vanish overnight. Priests abandon their flocks. The stench of decay hangs thick in the air. This was the Black Death, a nightmare that wiped out nearly half of Europe in just a few years. But what if everything we think we know about this catastrophe is wrong? What if the true story of history's deadliest pandemic has been hiding in plain sight all along? For centuries, we've blamed filthy streets and rat-infested alleys for the plague's spread. We've pointed fingers at fleas and medieval ignorance, but modern science and forgotten records are unraveling a far more complex truth. Hidden beneath the layers of time are clues that challenge everything, from where the plague really began to how it moved with terrifying speed across continents. Some researchers now believe the Black Death didn't behave like any ordinary outbreak. Its patterns defy explanation. Entire villages were wiped out while others nearby mysteriously survived. Why, and what if the plague never truly left us? Its echoes linger in our genes, our societies, even our fears. This isn't just a story about a disease. It's a detective story, one that stretches from the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of medieval Europe. Along the way, we'll uncover shocking evidence of biological warfare, long-lost trade routes that served as highways for death, and the chilling possibility that the plague's greatest weapon wasn't just biology but human nature itself. By the end, you'll see history's darkest hour in a whole new light and question what other secrets might still be waiting to be unearthed. So let's step into the shadows and piece together the hidden truths behind the Black Death. To understand how the Black Death tore through Europe with such ferocity, we first need to step into the world as it was in the early 1300s. Picture a continent already on the brink where cities had swollen far beyond what their crumbling infrastructures could handle. Streets were narrow, dark, and choked with waste. People lived piled atop one another, their homes little more than wooden hovels shared with livestock. There were no sewers, no clean water, no concept of germs. But it wasn't just filth that set the stage for disaster. Nature itself seemed to turn against them. The Little Ice Age had begun its grip on Europe, bringing brutal winters and failed harvests. Crops rotted in the fields under endless rain, while summers dried into dust. Famine became a constant specter, weakening entire populations. Malnourished bodies had no strength to fight off disease, and the social fabric frayed under the strain. Trade routes, the very lifeblood of medieval economies, now became highways for catastrophe. Ships carried grain to stave off hunger, but they also carried rats. Merchants brought silks and spices, but also fleas. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites, unknowingly spreading infection with every step. This was a world perfectly primed for an apocalyptic event, where one spark could ignite an unstoppable fire. And when that spark came, it found a civilization already teetering on the edge. For generations, the story was simple. Rats carried fleas, fleas bit humans, and the Black Death spread like wildfire. But that explanation is starting to crack under the weight of new evidence. Archaeologists studying mass graves across Europe have made a startling discovery. Many victims died so quickly, there simply wasn't time for rats and fleas to spread the infection at such a catastrophic scale. In some towns, the plague wiped out entire communities in a matter of days, faster than any rodent population could have moved. So if not rats, then what? One compelling theory points to human fleas and body lice as silent accomplices. Unlike rat fleas, these pests lived directly on people, hitching rides in clothing and bedding. When an infected person died, their parasites would swarm to the nearest warm body, creating a terrifyingly efficient transmission chain. Even more chilling is the possibility of pneumonic plague, a version of the disease that spread through coughs and breath, turning every marketplace, every church gathering into a potential death trap. Eyewitness accounts describe victims coughing blood before collapsing, their lungs drowning in infection. This airborne strain could explain why the plague ravaged some regions with lightning speed while sparing others entirely. But the plot thickens. Some researchers argue the Black Death spread aligns eerily with medieval trade routes, not just the movement of goods but of people. Pilgrims, soldiers, and merchants might have carried the plague in their bodies long before symptoms appeared, seeding outbreaks far from where they first fell ill. There's even evidence suggesting certain blood types offered natural resistance, creating random pockets of survival in the chaos. The truth may be that the Black Death wasn't just one monster, but many, a perfect storm of transmission methods that exploited every weakness in medieval society. What we're learning now forces us to rethink not just how the plague moved, but how we prepare for pandemics today. Because if history's deadliest killer didn't play by the rules we assumed, what else might we have gotten wrong? Here's where the story takes a bizarre turn. If rats were truly the primary culprits behind the Black Death, medieval records should be overflowing with reports of swarming rodents dying in the streets, infesting homes, collapsing under the weight of their own fleas. But something strange happens when you scour first-hand accounts from the time. Rats are almost entirely absent from the narrative. Chroniclers wrote in horror about the piles of human corpses, the abandoned villages, the eerie silence in once busy cities, but they rarely mentioned dead rats. Archaeologists have uncovered another glaring inconsistency. When they examined mass graves from plague outbreaks across Europe, they found something, or rather, didn't find something, that defies expectations. Scattered among the human remains, there should have been evidence of rats. Bones, teeth, the telltale signs of a mass die-off among rodent populations. Instead, these so-called plague pits contained almost no rat remains at all. In some cases, researchers found more evidence of rats in graves from periods without plague than during the Black Death itself. So where does that leave the classic rat and flea theory? Some scientists argue that certain rodent species, like the black rat, may have been so thoroughly wiped out by the plague that their absence in the record isn't surprising. Others point to an even more unsettling possibility. Maybe rats weren't the main drivers of transmission at all. Take the case of Iceland, an island with virtually no rats during the medieval period. Yet when the Black Death arrived there in 1402, it killed with the same terrifying efficiency as it did in rat-infested London or Paris. How the answer might lie in human behavior itself, in cramped medieval homes where families slept piled together for warmth, body lice and fleas thrived. A single infected traveler could introduce the plague into a household, and within days, the parasites living in their clothing or bedding could jump to every person inside. Even the seasonal patterns of the Black Death raise questions. Rat-borne plagues typically surge in warm weather when fleas are most active, yet some of the worst outbreaks in Europe happened during freezing winters when flea activity should have plummeted. This has led researchers to consider another chilling vector, human-to-human transmission through coughs, blood, or even contaminated food and water. The deeper we dig, the clearer it becomes the Black Death wasn't a simple story of rats and fleas. It was a shapeshifter exploiting every possible weakness in medieval life. And if we've misunderstood how it spread, what else might we have wrong about history's deadliest pandemic? The Black Death wasn't a single, unstoppable wave. It was a series of storms, each with its own deadly rhythm. Scientists examining ancient tree rings and ice cores have uncovered a startling pattern. The 1300s weren't marked by one uniform catastrophe, but by multiple outbreaks with wildly different footprints. Some regions burned through populations in months, while others suffered slower, grinding waves of death over decades. Even stranger, not all these outbreaks left the same scars in the historical record. Some killed 60% of a town's population, others barely touched 10%. This inconsistency has led researchers to a provocative question: were we fighting one enemy or several wearing the same mask? Take the case of the plague of Justinian, which ravaged Europe 600 years before the Black Death. For centuries, historians assumed it was the same disease, Yersinia pestis, just an earlier appearance. But when scientists extracted DNA from its victims' teeth, the strain looked different, not a sibling to the Black Death plague, but a distant cousin. This discovery rips open the possibility that what we call plague might be a family of diseases, some far deadlier than others. Now, layer on another revelation from ice cores drilled deep into Greenland's glaciers. These frozen time capsules contain atmospheric dust from the medieval world, and their chemistry tells a grim story. The years of the worst Black Death outbreaks coincide with sharp spikes in lead pollution, evidence of mining collapses and economic chaos. But here's the twist: some plague waves hit during periods of relative stability. If famine and social breakdown fueled the deadliest outbreaks, why did others strike when societies were strong? This fractures the old narrative into competing theories. One camp argues that every medieval plague was Yersinia pestis, but environmental factors like a sudden drop in temperature or a crop failure could amplify its lethality. Others point to genetic analysis of plague victims showing subtle strain variations, suggesting mutated versions might have emerged mid-pandemic. Then there's the most controversial idea, that some plague outbreaks weren't plague at all, but entirely different diseases: anthrax, typhus, or even viral hemorrhagic fevers, exploiting the chaos. Consider London's records from 1665, when a so-called plague outbreak killed 1 in 5 citizens. Eyewitnesses described symptoms that don't quite match Yersinia pestis: violent nosebleeds, rashes spreading like ink in water. Were they documenting a plague strain we've since lost to history, or something else entirely? Without time travel, we may never know for sure. But one thing's certain: the Black Death was never just one monster. It was a chorus of shadows, each singing a different tune of devastation. And that revelation changes everything, not just about the past, but about how we prepare for the pandemics of tomorrow. Imagine standing in a field of wheat during the Great Drought of 1318. The stalks crumble to dust between your fingers. The sky stays stubbornly blue day after day, while underground something else is stirring. This wasn't just bad luck, it was the opening act of one of history's deadliest chain reactions. Climate scientists drilling into ancient ice and studying tree rings have uncovered a startling pattern. The Black Death didn't just exploit human vulnerability, it was invited by the weather itself. The early 1300s marked the beginning of what's now called the Little Ice Age, a period of wild climate swings that destabilized ecosystems across Eurasia. But it wasn't just the cold that set the stage for disaster, it was the chaos. Years of unrelenting rain would drown crops, followed by droughts so severe they cracked the earth. These extreme shifts did more than cause famine, they supercharged rodent populations. When warm, wet springs hit, grasslands exploded with vegetation, providing a feast for mice and voles. Their numbers would skyrocket, creating ideal conditions for fleas to multiply. Then, when drought struck, these overpopulated rodent colonies collapsed, sending infected fleas scrambling for new hosts like humans. Take the steppes of Central Asia, where genetic evidence suggests the plague may have originated. Tree rings from Mongolia tell a story of back-to-back climate whiplash. In 1328, torrential rains created a rodent paradise. Just 4 years later, a bone-dry summer left the grasslands barren. Starving gerbils and marmots, natural carriers of Yersinia pestis, crowded into human settlements, bringing their deadly passengers with them. But the climate connection gets even eerier. When researchers mapped major plague outbreaks across centuries, they noticed something extraordinary. The worst waves consistently followed periods of abrupt climate change. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century erupted after the massive volcanic winter of 536. The Black Death followed the Great Drought of the early 1300s. Even later resurgences, like the Great Plague of London in 1665, coincided with sudden temperature drops. This isn't just ancient history. Modern climate models suggest a disturbing parallel. Today's warming world is creating similar ecological disruptions. As permafrost thaws and rodent habitats shift, scientists have documented plague bacteria surviving in soil for centuries. The past may be whispering a warning. When the climate destabilizes, the shadows of old diseases stir. And if history teaches us anything, it's that humanity is often the last domino to fall in a chain reaction started by the weather. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for spices and silk, it was a highway for death. For centuries, historians pointed to China as the birthplace of the Black Death, citing ancient texts that described apocalyptic plagues in the 14th century. But when geneticists began extracting DNA from medieval plague victims, the story took an unexpected detour. The strain of Yersinia pestis responsible for Europe's nightmare didn't trace back to Chinese ports, but to the rugged highlands of Central Asia, specifically a remote corner of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. In a quiet valley near Lake Issyk-Kul, archaeologists unearthed a graveyard with a chilling clue: tombstones from 1338 and 1339, inscribed with the word pestilence in Syriac. These weren't just any graves, they held the earliest known victims of the Black Death. When scientists analyzed their teeth, they found the genetic blueprint of the plague that would soon ravage Europe. But here's the twist: this strain was already a seasoned killer. Its DNA showed mutations suggesting it had been circulating for decades, possibly centuries, before reaching the Silk Road. So where did it really begin? Some researchers argue the answer lies in the marmot-filled grasslands of the Tian Shan Mountains, where plague still lurks in rodent populations today. Others point to a more controversial origin: Europe itself. A handful of genetic studies have found traces of Yersinia pestis in Bronze Age skeletons from Russia and Germany, dating back thousands of years before the Black Death. Could the plague have been smoldering in Europe all along, waiting for the perfect storm of climate change and social upheaval to explode? The Silk Road theory gets even murkier when you follow the money. Medieval trade records show a sudden drop in caravans traveling from Central Asia in the 1330s, not because of plague but war. The Mongol Empire was fracturing, and battles along the Silk Road may have disrupted rodent habitats, forcing infected animals into human settlements. Meanwhile, Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice were trading furiously with the East, their ships carrying more than just goods. In 1346, a Mongol army besieging the Crimean port of Kaffa allegedly catapulted plague victims over the city walls, one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare. Whether true or not, the siege sent Genoa's ships fleeing straight to Constantinople, then Messina, then Marseille, unwittingly delivering the plague to Europe's doorstep. But the most shocking revelation comes from comparing plague strains across continents. The version that hit Europe was genetically distinct from the one that ravaged China in the same period, suggesting multiple outbreaks were unfolding simultaneously, not a single wave spreading outward. This could explain why some regions suffered repeated blows while others escaped relatively unscathed. The Black Death wasn't a monolith, it was a mosaic of tragedies, each with its own origin story. And that makes its legacy all the more terrifying. If it could emerge from multiple points at once, what's stopping history from repeating itself? The Siege of Kaffa reads like something out of a medieval horror story. In 1346, a Mongol army surrounded the bustling Crimean port, a vital hub for Genoese merchants trading silks and spices from the east. Months dragged on, supplies dwindled, and then the unthinkable happened. Plague erupted in the Mongol camp, but instead of retreating, the besiegers allegedly turned catastrophe into weapon. According to a single surviving account by Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, the Mongols catapulted plague-ridden corpses over Kaffa's walls, deliberately infecting the city. Within weeks, terrified Genoese sailors fled by ship, carrying the Black Death straight to Europe's doorstep. If true, this would be one of history's first recorded acts of biological warfare. But how much of this story holds up under scrutiny? The case for the bioweapon theory hinges on three key points. First, the Mongols had motive. Kaffa was a thorn in their side, a Christian outpost resisting their control. Second, they had opportunity. The plague was already ravaging their camp, making infected corpses readily available. Third, psychological warfare was a well-documented Mongol tactic. From flaming arrows to severed heads launched by trebuchets, they specialized in terror. Even the timing aligns. Genoese ships fleeing Kaffa reached Sicily just as the Black Death first appeared in Europe. But skeptics raise compelling counter-arguments. De Mussi's account is the only one that mentions the corpse tactic, and he wasn't an eyewitness. No Mongol records corroborate the event, which would have been a major military operation. More critically, modern epidemiologists question whether the method would even work. Plague bacteria die quickly in corpses exposed to sunlight, and catapulting bodies would scatter infected fleas inefficiently. Some historians suggest the story may have been Genoese propaganda, a way to shift blame for bringing the plague to Europe. Perhaps the most damning evidence against the theory comes from genetics. Studies of plague strains show the Black Death likely entered Europe through multiple ports simultaneously, not just Kaffa. Genoese ships from Constantinople and other Black Sea ports were just as likely carriers. Yet the story persists because it taps into a darker truth. Whether or not the Mongols weaponized the plague, human conflict undoubtedly accelerated its spread. War-displaced populations crammed refugees into unsanitary conditions and forced movements of people along trade routes, creating the perfect breeding ground for pandemic. This leaves us with a haunting question. Does it matter if the Kaffa story is literally true? Symbolically, it captures how quickly crisis can turn humans into unwitting or even deliberate agents of destruction. The real weapon wasn't just plague-ridden corpses, but the collapse of trust, the scramble for survival, the desperate decisions made in shadow of death. Even without catapults, the siege of Kaffa became a grim landmark, the moment when the medieval world learned how easily warfare and disease could become intertwined. And that lesson, unfortunately, is one we've had to relearn throughout history. In the shadow of the Black Death's devastation, a curious pattern emerged, one that baffled chroniclers then and still puzzles scientists today. While some villages vanished from the map entirely, others stood untouched, as if protected by an invisible shield. Take the village of Iam in England, where residents deliberately quarantined themselves to stop the plague's spread. 60% perished, a tragic toll, yet far lower than neighboring towns. Then there's Milan, where aggressive containment measures kept deaths under 15%. But the most startling cases are places like Poland and parts of Belgium, where records show almost no plague deaths at all. What made these communities the miracle survivors of history's deadliest pandemic? The answer may lie in our genes. Recent studies of descendants from plague-resistant regions reveal telltale mutations, tiny changes in DNA that might have turned their ancestors into unwitting biological fortresses. One such mutation, found in a gene called ERAP2, appears to help immune systems recognize and destroy Yersinia pestis more efficiently. Populations with this variant had a 40% higher chance of surviving the Black Death. But here's what's truly astonishing. These genetic shields didn't evolve randomly. The plague literally rewrote human DNA, favoring those with natural resistance and wiping out vulnerable bloodlines. Modern Europeans are essentially the offspring of the plague's survivors, carrying their biological armor in our cells. Geography played its part too. Isolated communities like highland villages in the Pyrenees or remote valleys in the Alps had fewer travelers bringing infection. But isolation alone doesn't explain why some densely populated cities fared better than others. Venice's early use of maritime quarantines, keeping ships anchored for 40 days before docking, likely slowed the plague's spread. Meanwhile, Jewish communities, often blamed and persecuted during outbreaks, sometimes had lower mortality rates due to strict hygiene laws in kosher practices. Then there's the baffling case of the Roma people, who migrated through plague-ravaged lands yet show little evidence of mass deaths in their oral histories. Geneticists suspect their nomadic lifestyle, constantly moving in small, dispersed groups, may have prevented the sustained transmission needed for catastrophic outbreaks. Perhaps the most provocative theory involves blood types. The Duffy negative blood variant, common in West Africa and virtually absent in medieval Europe, confers partial resistance to malaria, but researchers now believe it may have also helped against plague. This could explain why the Black Death never gained a foothold in sub-Saharan Africa despite thriving trade routes. Nature, it seems, had already stacked the deck in some populations' favor. But immunity wasn't just about biology. Cultural practices shaped survival too. In Russia, where bathhouses were commonplace, the combination of heat and frequent washing may have disrupted flea populations. Meanwhile, Norway's low death toll has been attributed to its scattered farms and a tradition of storing grain in elevated barns, keeping it away from rodents. The legacy of these survivors lives on in more ways than one. Those same genetic mutations that offered plague resistance are now linked to modern autoimmune diseases, suggesting the price of survival might still be written in our bodies. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of the miracle survivors. Pandemics don't just kill, they sculpt. They reshape populations, redirect evolution, and leave behind clues about how humanity endures. In studying those who outlasted the darkness, we might just find the tools to face whatever comes next. Amid the chaos of the Black Death, a disturbing contradiction emerged. Jewish communities across Europe found themselves brutally scapegoated for the plague, accused of poisoning wells, cursing the faithful, even conspiring with the devil. Mobs burned synagogues, massacres erupted from Spain to Germany. Yet hidden beneath this horrific persecution lies a stunning fact. In many regions, Jewish populations actually suffered lower death rates than their neighbors. How could the very people blamed for spreading death have somehow avoided its worst ravages? The answer begins with sanitation. Jewish law, grounded in ancient Torah and Talmudic teachings, imposed strict hygiene practices long before germs were understood. Ritual hand-washing before meals wasn't just spiritual, it physically removed contaminants. Kosher dietary laws forbade eating sick or improperly slaughtered animals, reducing exposure to infected meat. Perhaps most crucially, mikvah's ritual baths required regular full-body immersion in flowing water, a practice that would have disrupted flea and lice infestations. In a world where most Christians bathed a handful of times a year, these routines created an invisible barrier against disease. But cleanliness alone doesn't explain the paradox. Jewish communities also practiced early forms of quarantine. When plague struck, rabbinical authorities enforced isolation rules far stricter than secular societies. Suspected cases were confined immediately, sometimes in dedicated plague houses outside town. Travel between Jewish quarters was heavily restricted, and funeral rites, traditionally involving washing and close contact with the deceased, were modified to limit exposure. These measures mirrored what we now call infection control, though they were framed as religious obligations. Geography played a role too. Many Jewish neighborhoods were segregated, often crowded but internally cohesive. Unlike open city squares where strangers mingled, These enclaves had controlled entry points, making it easier to monitor newcomers for signs of illness. Some scholars argue this semi-isolation created a buffer when plague seeped into cities. It hit Jewish areas later and with less ferocity, giving communities time to enact protections. Yet the darkest irony lies in the persecution itself. As violence drove Jewish populations into tighter clusters, their very marginalization may have shielded them. Forced to rely on close-knit networks for survival, they developed systems of mutual aid, distributing food internally during lockdowns, caring for quarantined families, even creating rudimentary sick wards. Meanwhile, the broader Christian populace, fractured by fear, often abandoned the sick to die alone, accelerating the plague's spread. Records from Frankfurt tell a revealing story. When the plague arrived, the city's Jewish quarter was sealed off by authorities, not to protect its inhabitants, but to imprison them. Yet inside those walls, disciplined sanitation and communal care kept deaths at half the rate of the surrounding city. Similar patterns emerged in Strasbourg, where Jewish leaders implemented rotating shifts to tend the sick, minimizing each caregiver's exposure. This isn't to romanticize their suffering. Countless Jewish lives were still lost, and entire communities were obliterated by both plague and pogroms. But their survival strategies expose a painful truth. The very bigotry that cast them as villains inadvertently preserved practices that modern epidemiology would later deem essential. In a tragic twist, Europe's massacre of Jews during the Black Death may have destroyed some of the populations best equipped to fight the disease. Their story is a chilling reminder. When fear overrides reason, societies often dismantle the very defenses that could save them. Doctors facing the Black Death were armed with medieval medicine's most trusted tools, and nearly all of them made things worse. Imagine a physician arriving at your doorstep in his iconic plague mask, its long beak stuffed with pungent herbs. He'd take one look at your swollen lymph nodes and reach for a lancet. Bloodletting was the go-to cure, based on the ancient belief that illness stemmed from an imbalance of bodily humors. Patients already weakened by fever would lose pints of blood, accelerating their deaths. But that was just the beginning of the horrors. Some physicians prescribed erratic, a foul concoction of dozens of ingredients including viper's flesh and opium, believed to sweat out toxins. Others swore by rubbing chopped onions or crushed emeralds on buboes, the grotesquely swollen lymph nodes that gave the bubonic plague its name. One particularly gruesome remedy involved strapping live chickens to the afflicted areas, hoping the birds would draw out the disease. In Venice, doctors experimented with mercury baths, poisoning patients faster than the plague could kill them. Yet amid this carnival of quackery, a few accidental breakthroughs emerged. Officials in Milan noticed something startling. Neighborhoods where they boarded up plague-stricken houses, trapping the healthy inside with the dying, sometimes saw lower overall death rates. Though cruel, this crude quarantine inadvertently limited the disease's spread. Ragusa, a maritime republic, took it further by isolating incoming sailors on remote islands for 30 days, a practice called Trentino, that later inspired the 40-day quarantino, the origin of our modern quarantine. Even superstition yielded occasional benefits. The belief that foul air spread disease led some towns to burn aromatic woods in streets, unwittingly killing fleas with smoke. Florence's decision to burn victims' belongings, meant to purge evil spirits, actually destroyed contaminated fabric where fleas thrived. And in a twist of irony, the wealthy's habit of fleeing cities, once criticized as cowardice, often saved their lives by removing them from dense, infected areas. The tragedy lies in how close medieval society came to effective solutions without understanding why they worked. While doctors wasted time on mercury and chickens, the real answers were hiding in plain sight: isolation, sanitation, and avoiding the sick. It would take centuries before science caught up to these instincts, a delay that cost millions of lives. The Black Death didn't just expose medicine's ignorance, it revealed how easily desperate people can cling to the wrong remedies, even as the right ones slip through their fingers. That haunting image of the beaked plague doctor, clad in black robes and a grotesque bird-like mask, has become synonymous with the Black Death. But here's the unsettling truth: those ominous figures weren't stalking the streets of 1300s Europe at all. The iconic costume didn't appear until nearly 3 centuries after the Black Death's peak, during later outbreaks in the 1600s. It's a case of history's imagination playing tricks on us, a symbol so powerful it retroactively rewrote our visual memory of the pandemic. So what did medieval physicians wear when facing the plague? The reality was both simpler and more horrifying. Picture a healer draped in ordinary robes, perhaps with a leather apron stained by blood and vomit. No gloves, no sealed goggles, just bare hands pressing against oozing buboes, cloth masks, if worn at all, soaked through with the stench of death. Some wrapped scarves around their faces, believing the fabric could filter bad air, while others relied on strong perfumes to ward off miasma. Their tools were just as crude: unsterilized lancets for bloodletting, poultices of dubious herbs, and vials of tinctures that often did more harm than good. The beaked mask's late arrival reveals a fascinating twist in plague history. Designed by Charles Delorme, physician to French royalty in 1616, the costume was meant for outbreaks after the Black Death, like the Great Plague of London. Even then, its effectiveness was pure theater. The beak, stuffed with aromatic spices like myrrh or camphor, followed the discredited miasma theory that foul smells caused disease. The long coat and gloves, more about status than protection, marking doctors as elites brave enough to confront death. Yet the myth persists because it taps into something deeper: our need to visualize chaos. The plague doctor's costume, with its eerie anonymity and exaggerated features, perfectly embodies the terror of an invisible enemy. It's no accident that modern pandemic imagery, from hazmat suits to masked healthcare workers, echoes its silhouette. But the real lesson lies in the contrast between perceived safety and actual science. Medieval doctors, whether in simple robes or elaborate beaks, were fighting a foe they didn't understand with tools that couldn't help. Their failures remind us that symbols of protection often say more about our fears than our knowledge, and that's a warning that transcends centuries. The Black Death didn't just claim lives, it shattered an entire economic system that had lasted for centuries. In the wake of the plague, Europe faced a paradox. With nearly half the population gone, the survivors found themselves holding unexpected power. Fields lay fallow, workshops stood empty, and lords who once commanded armies of serfs suddenly had no one to till their lands. The scarcity of labor turned the feudal order on its head. For the first time in history, peasants could demand higher wages, better conditions, and even their freedom. A day's work that once earned a medieval laborer a few pennies now fetched triple or quadruple the price. In England, the government tried desperately to freeze wages with the Statute of Labourers in 1351, commanding workers to accept pre-plague rates. But the law was utterly unenforceable. You couldn't force people back into poverty when their hands had become so valuable. This seismic shift wasn't just about money. Entire social structures crumbled. Serfs who had been tied to their lord's land for generations now abandoned barren estates for opportunities elsewhere. Villages that lost too many workers were simply left to ruin, their fields reclaimed by forest. Meanwhile, skilled artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters found themselves in such high demand that guilds loosened their restrictive rules to attract new members. The plague had accidentally created something unprecedented, a labor market where workers held the upper hand. The most surprising evidence of this transformation lies in archaeological finds from rural England. Excavations of peasant homes built after the Black Death reveal shocking upgrades: stone foundations replacing dirt floors, glass windows where there had once been only shutters, even imported pottery from as far away as Spain. These weren't the hovels of downtrodden serfs, but comfortable dwellings of a newly empowered class. Tax records from Florence show similar trends. The average worker's real income skyrocketed by nearly 50% in the decades following the plague. For some, disaster had become opportunity, but the economic revolution went deeper than individual prosperity. With so many heirs wiped out, inherited wealth concentrated in fewer hands, creating new elites. Women, often barred from skilled trades before the plague, stepped into vacant roles as brewers, tailors, and even doctors. The church, once the dominant landowner, saw its influence wane as pious donations dried up and survivors questioned divine justice. Even warfare changed. With fewer peasants to conscript, kings turned to paid mercenaries, laying the groundwork for professional armies. Perhaps the most lasting change was the rise of movable type in the 15th century. As demand for books grew among the newly literate middle class, Johannes Gutenberg's press found its audience. The plague hadn't just reshaped economies, it had created a world hungry for ideas, mobility, and progress. The old feudal system, built on rigid hierarchies and cheap labor, could never fully recover. In its place emerged something far more dynamic, a world where human lives, not just land, held real value. And that shift would echo through the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and beyond. The Black Death didn't just kill, it forced humanity to reinvent itself. Venice in the 1400s was a city under siege, not by armies, but by an invisible enemy. As ships from plague-ridden ports docked daily, its leaders faced an impossible choice: close the gates to trade and starve, or stay open and risk annihilation. Their desperate solution would change the course of history. In 1423, the Venetian Senate decreed that all incoming vessels must anchor at the isolated island of Lazaretto Nuovo for 40 days before entering the city. They called it quarantino, derived from the Italian word for 40. What began as a hunch would become the world's first systematic public health policy, birthing concepts we still rely on today. But why 40 days? Medieval physicians believed this period allowed corrupted air to disperse. In reality, it was eerily prescient. The incubation period for bubonic plague averages 37 days. The system worked with shocking precision. Ships' crews were isolated in stone warehouses where their belongings were aired out on rope lines, an early form of fumigation. Officials documented every fever, every cough in ledgers that still survive, creating the first known disease surveillance records. Those who fell ill were transferred to Lazaretto Vecchio's pest house, where doctors in wax-coated robes practiced proto-isolation protocols. The result: Venice suffered repeated plague waves, but never the catastrophic losses seen elsewhere. The true revolution wasn't just medical, it was bureaucratic. To enforce quarantino, Venice developed an unprecedented administrative machine. Health magistrates wielded powers akin to modern agencies, inspecting ships, issuing cleanliness certificates, and tracking movement with paperwork that presaged passports. Merchants chafed under the delays, but the system's success bred imitation. By 1485, Milan had established permanent health boards, Ragusa-mandated plague hospitals. These weren't temporary measures, but enduring institutions, the skeleton of modern public health infrastructure. Perhaps the most surprising legacy lies in urban design. The Lazaretto's layout, with separate zones for observation, treatment, and convalescence, became the blueprint for hospitals worldwide. Their record-keeping inspired early clinical trials as physicians compared outcomes across isolation periods. Even Venice's maritime maps gained new layers, marking plague zones with red ink like epidemiological heat maps. Yet the greatest impact was philosophical. For the first time, survival wasn't left to prayer or potions. It was systematized. Quarantino proved that diseases could be managed through collective action and rigid protocols. When the next Great Plague hit in 1576, Venice's death toll was 1/3 of London's. The lesson echoed through centuries. The 40-day wait birthed the radical idea that governments, not just individuals, bore responsibility for public health. And that shift from helplessness to institutionalized protection may be the Black Death's most enduring gift to modernity. When the Black Death struck, Europe turned instinctively to the Church, the one institution that had promised divine protection in exchange for faith. But as bodies piled up in churchyards and priests themselves succumbed to the plague, a terrible realization spread faster than the disease. Prayer offered no shield. The clergy, sworn to tend the dying, often fled. Sacraments like last rites became death sentences for those administering them. In Avignon, the Pope's own physician noted grimly that the Church's remedies failed as utterly as the physician's potions. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was a spiritual earthquake that cracked the foundations of medieval Christianity. Out of the chaos rose the flagellants, one of history's most disturbing religious movements. These zealous bands wandered from town to town, their bare backs crisscrossed with self-inflicted wounds from iron-tipped whips. They believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and that only extreme penance could appease divine wrath. Eyewitnesses described their processions as hypnotic horrors, men and women chanting in unison, lashing themselves until the streets ran red, collapsing in ecstatic agony. At their peak, the movement claimed hundreds of thousands of followers across Germany and the Low Countries, but their radicalism soon turned violent. Accusing Jews and corrupt clergy of bringing God's judgment, flagellant mobs began massacring entire communities. The Church, terrified by this challenge to its authority, finally condemned them in 1349, yet the damage was done. The spectacle of bloodied penitence had exposed a terrifying truth. When institutions fail, people will create their own salvation, no matter how brutal. The plague didn't just spark temporary fanaticism, it planted seeds that would bloom into the Protestant Reformation. As graveyards overflowed, survivors began questioning why God spared drunkards and thieves while pious monks perished. The Church's explanation that this was a test of faith rang hollow to those who'd buried whole families. Local priests, seeing their congregations vanish, started holding Mass in vernacular languages instead of Latin, quietly defying Vatican doctrine. Most revolutionary of all, the plague accelerated the spread of personal prayer books as literate laypeople sought direct communion with God, bypassing clergy altogether. These cracks in ecclesiastical control would widen over generations, culminating in Martin Luther's revolt against church corruption, a revolt made possible by the Black Death's erosion of blind obedience. Archaeological evidence reveals just how deeply faith was shaken. Excavations of plague-era graves show a startling decline in traditional Christian burial practices: fewer crosses, fewer inscriptions invoking saints. Some bodies were even buried face down, a deliberate insult suggesting the dead had lost hope in resurrection. In England, church construction plummeted for decades after the plague, while funding for monasteries dried up. The wealthy, once eager to buy indulgences for their souls, now willed their fortunes to secular causes. Yet the crisis also birthed strange new forms of devotion. The cult of St. Roch, patron saint of plague victims, spread like wildfire, his iconography showing him lifting his robe to reveal a bubo on his thigh, a shockingly graphic depiction of shared suffering. Artists began portraying the Dance of Death, where skeletons dragged emperors and peasants alike to the grave, a stark reminder that the Church's hierarchy meant nothing in the face of mortality. What emerged from this spiritual chaos was a world where faith had to be reinvented, where divine justice no longer fit neatly into church doctrine. The Black Death didn't just kill believers, it killed blind belief itself, forcing Christianity to evolve or perish. And in that painful rebirth lay the origins of modern religious thought, one where doubt and devotion could coexist, where the relationship between humanity and the divine would never again be so simple. The streets of medieval Europe were haunted by a new kind of performance, one where death wasn't an end, but a dancing partner. In the years following the Black Death, a chilling artistic motif spread across churches, cemeteries, and manuscripts, the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. These macabre frescoes and woodcuts showed skeletons leading people from every walk of life: kings, peasants, merchants, priests, in a grinning, skeletal procession toward the grave. At first glance, they seem like simple reminders of mortality, but look closer and you'll find something far more radical. In a world where social hierarchies had been upended by plague, the Danse Macabre delivered a scathing message: death was the great equalizer. A pope's crown meant nothing when his bony counterpart clutched his hand. A banker's gold couldn't buy him a reprieve from the skeletal fiddler's tune. This art wasn't just philosophical, it was deeply therapeutic. Imagine a survivor stumbling into a church in 1450, still reeling from losing their entire family. The Danse Macabre offered them a peculiar comfort. Everyone, from the lowliest beggar to the most arrogant noble, had shared their fate. Some historians argue these images helped medieval society process collective trauma by giving death a face, one that could be mocked, challenged, even danced with. In Baram, Croatia, a 15th century fresco shows death as a ragged musician playing a psaltery while a nobleman reluctantly dances. The message: you might not control when death comes, but you can choose how you meet it. The plague also revived an ancient tradition: memento mori art objects designed to remind viewers of their inevitable end. Skulls appeared on everything from rings to hourglasses, often inscribed with phrases like, "As I am, so shall you be." A particularly haunting example is the Danse tomb, where sculptors depicted corpses in various stages of decay, sometimes with worms crawling through their ribs. These weren't just morbid decorations, they were spiritual tools. In an age where life could vanish in hours, memento mori pushed people to live virtuously while they still could. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. These medieval expressions of terror never truly disappeared, they evolved. The skeletal personification of death in the Danse Macabre is the direct ancestor of the Grim Reaper, a figure now embedded in global pop culture. Turn on any zombie movie and you'll see echoes of plague-era mass graves in the shuffling hordes. Modern horror tropes, the hooded figure with a scythe, the ticking clock counting down to doom, all trace back to the Black Death's artistic aftermath. Even fantasy genres borrow from this legacy. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, with its infamous Valor Morgulis, All Men Must Die mantra, channels the memento mori tradition. Video games like Dark Souls or Bloodborne drown their worlds in Danse Macabre imagery, where death is both inevitable and cyclical. Perhaps the most profound influence lies in how we process modern pandemics. During the AIDS crisis, Keith Haring's skeletal figures echoed medieval plague art, confronting society with mortality's indiscriminate reach. More recently, COVID-era street art featured masked Grim Reapers hovering over empty cities, proof that when humanity faces invisible killers, we still reach for the same visual language forged in the 1400s. The Black Death didn't just change art history, it gave us a vocabulary for collective fear that remains unnervingly relevant 6 centuries later. And that may be its most haunting legacy of all: the realization that some shadows never fade, they simply find new forms. Buried within our very DNA lies an eerie legacy of the Black Death, biological scars from humanity's darkest hour that still shape lives today. Geneticists studying the bones of plague victims made a chilling discovery. The survivors didn't just endure the pandemic, they carried hidden advantages written into their genes. One particular mutation in a gene called erratic emerged as a stark dividing line between life and death. Those lucky enough to inherit this quirk of biology had immune systems that could recognize and dismantle Yersinia pestis with terrifying efficiency, giving them a 40% better chance of survival. Over generations, this genetic fluke spread like wildfire through Europe's descendants, not through chance, but because the plague literally weeded out those without it. The grim math of natural selection meant survivors passed their resistance to children, while vulnerable bloodlines vanished. But the story doesn't end with medieval immunity. These same genetic shields may have reshaped global history centuries later. When European explorers set sail for the Americas, they brought more than just ships and weapons. They carried diseases like smallpox that devastated indigenous populations. Here's the haunting twist. Some researchers believe the Black Death's DNA modifications primed European immune systems to weather these outbreaks too. The ERAP2 mutation, optimized against plague, might have incidentally provided cross-protection against other deadly pathogens. This could explain why colonizers often survived tropical fevers and New World epidemics that wiped out native communities. Not because of inherent superiority, but because their ancestors had been brutally pre-screened by history's deadliest filter. Yet survival came at a hidden cost. Those same life-saving mutations are now linked to modern autoimmune disorders like Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. It's as if our immune systems, supercharged to fight 14th-century nightmares, now occasionally turn their fury inward, attacking healthy tissue. Geneticists call this the thrifty immune system hypothesis, that our defenses evolved to go into overdrive at the slightest threat, a holdover from when the next plague wave could be lurking around any corner. Even our blood tells this story. Modern Europeans show significantly higher frequencies of blood type O compared to pre-plague populations, likely because it conferred some resistance to infection, another silent edit in humanity's genetic code. The most startling evidence comes from London's ancient cemeteries. DNA analysis of skeletons from before and after the Black Death reveals a dramatic shift in immune-related genes within just a few generations. Normally, such changes take millennia, but the plague's apocalyptic pressure accelerated evolution at breakneck speed. Similar studies in Denmark and Germany found parallel results, proving this wasn't a fluke. But perhaps the most poetic finding comes from plague pits in Ellwangen, Germany, where victims and survivors from the same families were buried side by side. Geneticists found survivors overwhelmingly carried a cluster of mutations on chromosome 4, a stretch of DNA now humorously nicknamed the Black Death Survival Pack by researchers. This genetic time bomb still ticks inside billions today. Up to half of modern Europeans carry some version of these plague-resistant mutations, their bodies unknowingly armored against microbial threats their ancestors couldn't have imagined. Yet in our modern world of sanitation and antibiotics, these once life-saving changes might now make us vulnerable to new enemies, from allergic disorders to inflammatory diseases. The Black Death didn't just alter history books, it rewrote the blueprint of human biology itself, proving that even the darkest chapters of our past never truly leave us. They live on in our cells, whispering secrets of survival and warning of trade-offs we're still unraveling. Deep inside the tooth of a medieval plague victim, something extraordinary lay hidden for centuries, not gold or jewels, but a microscopic time capsule holding the genetic blueprint of history's most notorious killer. In 2011, scientists made a breakthrough that sounded like science fiction. They extracted fragments of Yersinia pestis DNA from the dental pulp of skeletons buried in London's East Smithfield plague pits. Teeth, it turns out, are nature's perfect vaults. Their dense structure protects genetic material from decay, while the pulp chamber, sealed off from the outside world, acts like a biological safe deposit box for bacteria that once coursed through the victim's bloodstream. The process of recovering this ancient DNA reads like a forensic thriller. Researchers drilled gently into the teeth, careful not to generate heat that could destroy fragile genetic strands. What they pulled out wasn't intact plague cells, those had disintegrated long ago, but scattered pieces of bacterial DNA, shattered like a medieval manuscript torn into confetti. Using techniques borrowed from criminology and paleogenomics, they painstakingly reassembled these fragments, comparing them to modern plague strains. The result, a complete genome of the 14th century Black Death pathogen, the oldest fully reconstructed ancient bacterial DNA ever sequenced. This genetic time travel revealed shocking insights about how pathogens evolve. The medieval Yersinia pestis was nearly identical to modern versions, a testament to the bacterium's ruthless efficiency. Unlike viruses that constantly mutate to survive, the plague microbe found a winning formula and stuck with it. But there were subtle differences. The ancient strain carried unique genetic adaptations that may have made it even deadlier, including proteins that helped it evade medieval immune systems more effectively than today's plague. Perhaps the most startling discovery came when scientists compared the Black Death strain to its ancestor from the plague of Justinian 800 years earlier. Both descended from the same bacterial family tree, but the medieval version had acquired a critical genetic upgrade, a plasmid called PMT1, that turbocharged its ability to spread via fleas. This tiny ring of DNA turned an already deadly germ into an apocalyptic force, proving that sometimes the smallest genetic changes can have the most catastrophic consequences. Now, researchers are using these findings to track the plague's family tree even further back. Teeth from Bronze Age skeletons in Russia and Germany have yielded traces of Yersinia pestis dating back over 5,000 years, but these ancient versions lack the flea transmission gene. This suggests the plague spent millennia as a relatively obscure disease, possibly spreading through direct contact or contaminated food, before evolving into the medieval super killer we know. The implications stretch far beyond history books. By studying how the Black Death strain weaponized itself through evolution, scientists are uncovering patterns that could predict future pandemics. Modern sequencing techniques can now detect similar genetic upgrades in emerging diseases, giving us early warnings about which pathogens might turn catastrophic. Those medieval teeth don't just hold secrets of the past, they might hold keys to our survival in the next global health crisis. And that's the ultimate irony. The very thing that nearly wiped us out could now help save us. The idea that the Black Death might have reached North America before Columbus sounds like the plot of a sci-fi thriller, but mounting scientific evidence suggests this chilling possibility might be historical fact. In the 1990s, archaeologists excavating a Native American burial site near the Great Lakes made an unsettling discovery. Among the bones dating back to the 1300s, precisely when Europe was being ravaged by plague, they found something that shouldn't have been there. DNA analysis revealed traces of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death. How could this pathogen have crossed an ocean centuries before European contact? The answer might lie in the Arctic. Long before Columbus, the Dorset and Thule peoples of northern Canada engaged in trade networks stretching across the Bering Strait to Siberia, regions where plague was endemic. Some researchers propose that infected fleas could have hitchhiked on furs or rodents transported along these routes. Even more intriguing are accounts from Inuit oral histories describing devastating illnesses that swept through their ancestors' communities, symptoms eerily similar to plague: high fevers, swollen lymph nodes, rapid death. These stories, passed down for generations, align uncannily with the archaeological record. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source, a mass grave in present-day New Mexico. Among Puebloan remains from the late 1300s, scientists identified not just plague DNA but skeletal evidence of buboes. This was no ordinary epidemic. The timing coincides with the collapse of the ancestral Puebloans' sophisticated cliff dwellings, a mystery long attributed to drought. Now, some archaeologists wonder if plague played a role in their sudden disappearance. The most controversial evidence comes from coastal British Columbia, where geneticists found plague-resistant mutations in First Nations populations, mutations nearly identical to those that protected medieval Europeans. Since these genetic changes take centuries to develop, their presence suggests Native Americans were exposed to Yersinia pestis long before European contact. Skeptics argue these mutations could have evolved in response to other diseases, but the parallels are striking. If true, the implications rewrite history. The Americas weren't a pristine paradise untouched by old-world pathogens until 1492. They'd already endured their own plague cycles, possibly spread through trade routes we're only beginning to map. This theory could explain why some native communities collapsed before Europeans arrived, their ruins found empty with no signs of war or famine. It also raises haunting questions about how many other diseases crossed continents unnoticed, leaving only genetic scars and fragmented oral histories as clues. The mystery deepens when we consider the biological forensics. Plague strains found in pre-Columbian remains don't match the medieval European version exactly. They're closer to ancient Siberian variants. This suggests the bacterium may have taken multiple paths across the globe, evolving separately in isolated pockets. Some researchers even speculate that North America's prairie dog populations, known to carry plague today, might be descendants of medieval reservoirs established by these ancient transmissions. What emerges is a picture far more complex than the traditional narrative of a virgin soil epidemic after Columbus. The Black Death may have been a global pandemic in ways we're only beginning to understand, not just Europe's catastrophe, but a shadow that stretched across continents, leaving its mark in unexpected places. And if plague could cross oceans and ice ages without ships or railroads, what does that tell us about the relentless adaptability of diseases and the interconnectedness of our world long before we called it globalized? The Black Death never truly disappeared, it simply retreated into the shadows, biding its time in forgotten corners of the world. Today, Yersinia pestis still lurks in rodent burrows across every continent except Australia and Antarctica, from the prairie dog towns of the American Southwest to the marmot colonies of Central Asia. Modern scientists call these hotspots enzootic reservoirs, places where the plague circulates quietly among animal populations, occasionally spilling over into humans. But here's what's truly astonishing. Despite killing millions in the past, modern plague outbreaks rarely escalate beyond isolated cases. Why hasn't this ancient killer reclaimed its throne? Part of the answer lies in our changed world. Medieval Europe was a perfect storm of vulnerability, crowded cities, non-existent sanitation, and malnourished populations. Today, antibiotics can stop Yersinia pestis in its tracks if caught early, and public health systems quickly contain outbreaks. Even the way we build our homes works against the plague. Concrete floors and sealed walls leave few hiding places for the rats and fleas that once spread death so efficiently. Yet the bacteria itself hasn't grown weaker. Genetic studies comparing modern strains to their medieval ancestors reveal minimal differences in virulence. The same deadly machinery exists today, it just meets more resistance. Take the case of Madagascar, where plague remains endemic. Between 2010 and 2015, the island reported over 2,300 cases. But thanks to rapid antibiotic treatment, only 561 deaths occurred, a mortality rate under 25% compared to the Black Death 60 to 90% toll. The real wild card lies in the plague's ability to adapt. In 2017, scientists sounded alarms when they discovered a strain in Madagascar resistant to streptomycin, a first-line plague antibiotic. While still treatable with other drugs, this development raised a chilling question. What if Yersinia pestis evolves resistance to multiple antibiotics simultaneously? Some researchers worry that as climate change alters rodent habitats, bringing them closer to human settlements, the risks of spillover events could increase dramatically. Consider the peculiar case of the black-tailed prairie dog. These social rodents form vast underground colonies across western North America, their tunnels teeming with fleas that carry plague. When an outbreak hits a prairie dog town, it can wipe out 99% of the population, but the survivors, they're genetically resistant, just like medieval Europeans became. Now, imagine a scenario where climate-driven drought forces these plague-adapted rodents into closer contact with human suburbs, while antibiotic resistance spreads through bacterial populations. The ingredients for disaster start aligning. Perhaps the most sobering realization comes from lab experiments showing how easily Yersinia pestis can regain lost virulence. When scientists revived a medieval strain from dental pulp and compared it to modern versions, they found the ancient killer could still outperform its descendants under ideal conditions. The bacteria hasn't forgotten how to be apocalyptic, it's just waiting for the right circumstances to remind us. This leaves us with an unsettling paradox. We've built a world where the Black Death seems like a historical relic, yet the pathogen itself remains unchanged in nature's freezer, perfectly preserved in rodent blood. Our safety depends not on having defeated plague, but on maintaining the fragile barriers that keep it at bay: antibiotics, sanitation, surveillance. And as those walls show cracks from overuse and environmental upheaval, we're forced to ask, are we really living in a post-plague era, or just a long ceasefire in an ancient war? The answer may depend on how carefully we guard the peace. The climate chaos that set the stage for the Black Death wasn't just bad weather, it was a preview of the turbulent world we're entering now. Tree rings from the early 1300s tell a grim story. Relentless droughts followed by torrential rains, unpredictable growing seasons, and temperatures swinging wildly year to year. Sound familiar? Today's climate change mirrors these medieval patterns with eerie precision. Only now we're the ones turning up the heat. Scientists studying both periods have noticed something unsettling. When ecosystems get thrown off balance, diseases often seize the opportunity to rewrite the rules. Take what happened after the Great Drought of 1318. As Central Asia's grasslands baked dry, rodents desperate for food swarmed human settlements, bringing plague-infected fleas with them. Fast forward to 2019, when Australia's record-breaking wildfires drove similar waves of displaced animals into suburban areas, sparking fears of zoonotic disease transmission. The principle remains unchanged: disrupt a habitat and you force disease carriers into dangerous proximity with humans. But while medieval Europe faced localized climate shifts, we're dealing with planetary upheaval, melting permafrost releasing ancient pathogens, tropical diseases creeping into temperate zones, and extreme weather events creating ideal breeding grounds for pathogens. The parallels get even more disturbing when you examine disease vectors. Medieval Europe's plague surges often followed unseasonably warm, wet springs, conditions that turbocharged flea populations. Modern climate models predict similar spikes in insect-borne illnesses as global temperatures rise. Malaria's range is already expanding, with cases appearing in highland regions previously too cold for its mosquito carriers. Lyme disease ticks are marching northward at nearly 10 miles per year. Even cholera, which thrives in warm water, could see devastating resurgences as ocean temperatures climb. Perhaps the most ominous comparison lies beneath our feet. The Black Death's second wave in the 1500s coincided with the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling triggered by volcanic eruptions and reduced solar activity. Today, scientists warn that climate change could disrupt the Gulf Stream, potentially plunging Europe into colder conditions even as the planet overall heats up. This kind of climatic whiplash, exactly what made the 1400s so vulnerable to disease, could become our new normal, but here's where past and present diverge in frightening ways. Medieval people had no way to monitor or predict these changes. They were at the mercy of forces they couldn't comprehend. We have satellites tracking desertification, supercomputers modeling outbreak scenarios, and genetic tools to identify emerging threats. Yet for all our technology, we're repeating history's mistakes by ignoring the warning signs. The Black Death taught us that climate and disease are locked in a deadly dance, one we're now leading with our eyes wide open but still refusing to change our steps. The real question isn't whether history will repeat itself, but whether we'll finally learn from the patterns staring us in the face. The staggering death toll of the Black Death wasn't just a medieval tragedy, it was a crash course in pandemic survival written in blood and fire, one we're still failing to heed 7 centuries later. When COVID-19 first emerged, many assumed modern medicine had rendered ancient horrors obsolete. Yet within months, the same deadly patterns from the 1400s began replaying with eerie precision. Denials from leaders, finger-pointing at marginalized groups, and desperate scrambles for half-understood remedies. Venice's 40-day quarantines of the 1500s were eerily mirrored in 2020 by 2 weak isolation protocols, both arbitrary numbers chosen not by science but by the limits of public patience. Consider the parallels in misinformation. Medieval villagers burned aromatic herbs to ward off miasma, convinced bad air spread disease. 21st century crowds hoarded vitamin D supplements and bleach products, chasing equally misguided protections. The flagellant's violent processions found their modern counterpart in anti-mask rallies, where defiance of public health measures became twisted into perverse displays of identity. Even the scapegoating followed identical scripts, where Jews were massacred for allegedly poisoning wells in the 1300s. Asian communities faced xenophobic attacks during COVID for being falsely blamed as virus spreaders. The most damning repetition lies in the delayed responses. Italian city-states like Milan that immediately walled off plague-ridden homes suffered far fewer deaths than dithering neighbors. A lesson lost on governments that hesitated to restrict travel during COVID early days. Genetic evidence now shows the Black Death likely reached London months before authorities acknowledged it, just as coronavirus silently circled the globe while leaders downplayed the threat. Both pandemics exposed how bureaucratic inertia can become more lethal than any pathogen. Yet the most critical lesson hides in the aftermath. Medieval societies that rebuilt with wider streets, better sewage systems, and public health boards weathered later outbreaks more effectively. Similarly, countries like South Korea that combined rapid testing with technology, modern analogues to Venice's quarantine ledgers, fared better against COVID. The Black Death proved pandemics aren't freak disasters but inevitable stresses testing civilization's weakest joints. Our ancestors learned this through ruin. We're failing to apply their hard-won knowledge even with textbooks and genomic sequencing at our fingertips. The ultimate irony, today's plague researchers use cutting-edge PCR tests descendants of COVID diagnostics to study ancient Yersinia pestis in skeletons. The tools forged in our latest crisis are helping us dissect our oldest one, creating a loop where past and present endlessly inform each other. Perhaps that's the real warning buried in the bones. Preparedness isn't about predicting the next pandemic's shape, but recognizing humanity's unchanging vulnerabilities when fear meets the unknown. The microbes evolve, but our mistakes remain tragically familiar. Official records claim the Black Death wiped out 30 to 50% of Europe's population, but what if the true toll was far worse? Behind the neat parchment rolls of medieval scribes lies a disturbing possibility. The ruling classes had every reason to hide the full scale of death, and the evidence suggests they did exactly that. Take the English manor court rolls, where lords meticulously recorded peasant deaths not out of concern, but to tally lost labor. Even these self-serving documents show entire villages struck from the records after the plague, their fields left untended for generations. Yet church chronicles from the same period often report only the deaths of clergy and nobility, as if the peasantry barely existed before they vanished. The most glaring red flag emerges when comparing tax records before and after the plague. In Florence, taxable households dropped by 60%, but noble families reported only a 20% decline in their ranks. Either the aristocracy had divine protection or they were cooking the books. Some historians argue this wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate strategy. Admitting how many workers had died would have given surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power, something landowners desperately wanted to avoid. A revealing entry from the Essex archives shows a lord petitioning the king to reduce his tax liability due to pestilential losses, while simultaneously forcing his remaining tenants to pay pre-plague rents. The math doesn't add up unless corpses were being counted as taxable assets. Then there's the eerie silence of mass graves. Archaeology confirms many plague pits hold far more bodies than local chronicles acknowledge. In London's East Smithfield Cemetery, radiocarbon dating reveals layers of bodies deposited in chaotic haste, yet the city's official death toll for that year wouldn't fill a third of the graves. Even more telling are the discrepancies in rural areas. Monastic records from Yorkshire mention God's mild chastisement, wiping out a few dozen souls, while soil analysis shows nearby fields lay fallow for decades from lack of workers. The church's role in this cover-up may be the most cynical of all. By framing the plague as divine punishment, clergy could justify why pious nobles survived while sinful peasants perished. Surviving sermons from Avignon explicitly blame the poor for their own deaths, with one bishop claiming their filth invited God's wrath. Yet church account books tell a different story. When the Pope needed funds to rebuild plague-emptied monasteries, he suddenly discovered previously non-existent parishes had once paid substantial tithes, proof the dead had been systematically erased from financial records until their absence became inconvenient. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from what wasn't written at all. Thousands of medieval wills survive from noble families, abruptly skipping generations after 1348. Whole branches of family trees vanish without explanation, their lands redistributed to distant cousins. These gaps suggest even the elite couldn't hide their losses forever, just long enough to maintain the illusion of control. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it exposed how easily those in power could redraw reality with a quill and a lie, and that, more than any plague, is a disease we've never fully cured. Beneath the cobblestones of medieval cemeteries and tucked inside crumbling teeth, a revolution in plague science is unfolding, one that blends 21st century lab tech with 14th century bones. Paleogenomics, the ability to extract and sequence ancient DNA, has turned mass graves into biological time capsules. Scientists drill delicately into centuries-old molars, not for gold fillings, but for the genetic shrapnel of Yersinia pestis trapped in dental pulp. What they're discovering shreds old assumptions like parchment in a storm. Take the long-held belief that the Black Death was a single, uniform wave of destruction. Genomic analysis reveals it was more like a mutating storm, distinct strains emerging in different regions, some deadlier than others. A victim buried in London in 1348 carried a slightly different bacterial variant than one who died months later in Marseille, hinting at unseen evolutionary battles waging inside medieval bodies. Yet for all our technological prowess, the plague guards stubborn secrets. One enigma is the missing reservoirs, why some areas erupted with plague while nearby regions remained untouched despite similar conditions. Tree rings and soil samples confirm both places had rat populations and trade links, yet one became a graveyard, the other a refuge. Some researchers theorize about plague deserts, zones where local soil chemistry or flea species somehow block transmission. Others point to mysterious immune factors lost to history. In Norway, entire fjord communities survived unscathed despite being packed with infected trade goods. Were they shielded by genetics, diet, or pure luck? The bones refuse to tell. The most haunting unknown lurks in the plague's erratic timelines. In some towns, records show the dying peaked within weeks. In others, deaths trickled for years. Traditional epidemiology can't explain why. Now, microbiologists are testing a radical idea that medieval climate extremes caused Yersinia pestis to switch transmission modes. During wet summers, maybe fleas drove infections. In freezing winters, perhaps the pneumonic form took over, spreading through coughs in crowded hearths. This chameleon-like adaptability would make the Black Death far more terrifying than we imagined, not a single monster, but a shapeshifter exploiting every weakness. Perhaps the greatest puzzle lies in the plague's sudden retreat after 4 centuries of terror. By the 1700s, European outbreaks grew rarer, then vanished. We used to credit improved sanitation, but the timeline doesn't fit. Plague faded before major public health reforms. New evidence suggests a biological coup. Black rats carrying plague-resistant fleas may have outcompeted the deadly medieval flea species. It's a humbling reminder that nature, not medicine, might have ended history's greatest nightmare. Even with satellites and gene sequencers, we're still piecing together the Black Death's true story, one tooth, one genome, one unanswered question at a time. The Black Death wasn't just a medieval tragedy, it was a mirror reflecting truths we're still struggling to face today. We've traced its hidden fingerprints from the steppes of Central Asia to the mass graves of Europe, uncovering revelations that rewrite history. The plague didn't spread the way we were taught. Rats and fleas were only part of a far deadlier equation. Human fleas, breath-borne transmission, and even deliberate biological warfare all played their roles. We've seen how it reshaped our very DNA, leaving genetic scars that still influence our health centuries later. And perhaps most shockingly, we've learned it wasn't confined to Europe. Evidence suggests it may have reached the Americas long before Columbus, toppling civilizations we never knew were vulnerable. The greatest lesson isn't in the body count, but in the patterns we keep repeating. The same mistakes medieval societies made: denial, scapegoating, clinging to useless remedies, echoed loudly during COVID-19. Venice's 40-day quarantines were as arbitrary as our 2-week isolations. The flagellant's violent processions found their modern counterpart in anti-mask rallies. Even the persecution of Jewish communities during the plague mirrors the xenophobia unleashed during recent pandemics. History doesn't just rhyme, it screams warnings we've stubbornly ignored. Yet there's hope in the survivors' stories. Those who isolated the sick, prioritized sanitation, or possessed genetic resistance didn't just endure, they passed down hard-won wisdom. Today, we have tools our ancestors couldn't imagine: instant global communication, genomic sequencing, vaccines developed in months rather than decades. But technology alone won't save us. The true test lies in whether we can outthink our instincts, to resist panic, reject misinformation, and remember that pandemics don't discriminate. The next outbreak isn't a question of if, but when. And when it comes, will we finally heed the ghosts of 1448 whispering through the centuries? They've given us the playbook. The only uncertainty is whether we'll choose to read it. So tell us, which of these hidden truths shook you the most? Was it the plague's invisible reach across continents, the way it rewrote human genetics, or the chilling parallels to our modern struggles? Share your thoughts below, because the most dangerous plague isn't Yersinia pestis, it's forgetting. And that's one disease we can still vaccinate against if we choose to remember.